All right, Pat, it's great to see you. Long time no see. How have you been?
I'm very well, thank you, Orkan. Enjoying the summer as usual, a bit of a holiday, and it's good to have a bit of a break, really.
Yeah, you're mostly in Belfast now, as far as I understand.
Yeah, I will actually live in Northampton, which is not far from Belfast, but about 60, 70 kilometres. It's on the north coast. I'm about 20 miles from Scotland, actually, the very furthest northeast tip of Ireland.
By the way, I very much like the Kipling's Paddler you sent me a couple of days ago. That was really quite nice.
Yeah, I think Kipling had a great insight into the British state, and I think that the British state has certainly maintained a lot of the aspects that it had in the past, despite its transition to a democratic form of government. I think there are still elements of the old the oligarchic aristocracy which built the empire and obviously established the state over centuries. And I think that wisdom is still within the British state, and you could probably see it during the Brexit process.
The spirit of rural Britannia is still there, but not at the same scale.
No. It's a reduced version, I think, but but still, the
Yeah.
Okay.
Could you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Yeah. Sometimes a little bit of a lag, but it's okay. It's generally
that's the best internet in the building. So the last time when I was having a Zoom interview, we have a couple of embarrassing moments, but I'm sure on this occasion those moments will be limited. So Pat, just to start with, thank you very much indeed for your kind agreement to speak to us. It's a great honor and privilege. And you're a very well-known person and highly respected person in Azerbaijan. And I suggest that we construct our conversation in the following way. The most important thing which is happening around the globe now, the crisis in Ukraine. And I wanted to ask a couple of views about it. But the bulk of our conversation, I expect, is going to be about Azerbaijan, about ongoing Azerbaijani-Armenia peace process, the Zangezur corridor, the prospects of the peace treaty, the constant vacillation of Pashinyan's government, and many other issues of the kind. At the very end, I hope that our audience wouldn't mind. I will ask you just one small question about the toilet leadership race, which I'm sure you can succinctly reflect upon. So, Pat, I've been following you for many years, and my understanding and my feeling is that you believe that this financial campaign, this economic war mounted against Russia by Europe is not really very wise, and actually it is counterproductive. And also, in one of my conversations with you, you said that no one will win. Eventually, there will be no total winner because the West will be able to weaken Russia. And at the same time, Ukraine probably will be in the position of being truncated, losing effective control of its eastern provinces. But there will be rest of Western Ukraine, which will be more inclined towards West. And that will be the ultimate conclusion, ongoing ultimate conclusion.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Orkan. I mean, I'll just say, first of all, it is my pleasure to talk to you today. It's a real pleasure. I think you summarized my position very, very well, actually. I think, look, I'll start with really, a few months ago, I reread Samuel Huntington's famous Clash of Civilizations. And what the first time I'd read it, I didn't really notice his remarks about Ukraine in it, but he was very perceptive. Now, this book was written, I think, around about 1992 or something like this, maybe a bit later. But obviously, it It was written at the time when the Soviet Union is collapsing, and it's really a sort of like a sort of an open discussion with the American ruling political elite about what should be done. I mean, it's really a bit like Lenin's "What Should Be Done" sort of thing. But what he had a section on Ukraine, which was very interesting. He had the theory, and I think I subscribe to this actually, that there was a civilizational cleft that ran right the way down through, really through Eurasia, let's say, from between Western Europe and, well, he would describe it as Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And essentially, on one side, you have the Western Christian world, and on the other side, you have the Orthodox and Muslim world. And he noticed that the cleft ran right the way through Ukraine. It was unusual. And most other countries, it didn't run through them, but it ran through Ukraine. And what he said at that time, and that's like 30 years ago, is that there was a possibility Ukraine could develop good, a really strong, independent nationalist state, which was Western oriented. But if it did, it needed to shed its eastern provinces. He made this a bit further. I think he went to the Dnieper River, actually. But I mean, his insight is essentially that Ukraine was a sort of balancing state within itself, and it needed to actually keep a good balance. And I think it maintained that balance until around about 2013 and 14. And what really unbalanced it was essentially firstly the EU offer, which put Ukraine into a bit of a position about having to choose between Russia and the EU. Now, of course, we know there's other aspects of this. We know that the Americans got involved when they thought that the EU was foul political strategy, and Victoria Nuland made her famous remark, which I won't repeat, but it was on the lines of F the EU. And essentially then we had the Maidan coup against the government. And obviously the people in the east, the Donbass people, if we look at an electoral map of Ukraine, in that period, we see there's a great division. There's a sort of a Russian-oriented east, and there's a Western-oriented west. I mean, Ukrainian nationalism began in the west, Polish and Lithuanian rule of the. Essentially, it's not. We could describe it as two nations, right? But essentially, it's sort of two nations which was trying to become one nation in an independent state. And the problem was it got unbalanced in 2013 and 14, and it started the trajectory towards the current situation. So, some people say to me, why don't you see the Russian invasion, as they say, or as the Russians call it, the special military operation, as being the start of the war in Ukraine? Well, I don't see that, because the process really started around this time, and there's been an ongoing war for about 8 years. I mean, John Mearsheimer, the famous professor, who really advanced this theory around about the time of 2013 and 14. I wrote even articles about him and subscribing to his view that this was a dangerous situation and could well be tragic for Ukraine in the long term. So, yes, that's really my position, that I didn't think anybody was going to win out of this. I think the West, certain people in the West, obviously, were intent on luring Russia into the eastern of Ukraine, and with the objective of bleeding them dry, as the old Afghan war, Soviet-Afghan war, is the model for a lot of these people. And but unfortunately, Ukraine is not Afghanistan. It's a much more important thing for Russia, which means essentially that the conflict will be a qualitatively greater conflict than anything we've seen in the past. And the real problem with Ukraine is I see it as an existential crisis for Russia. I mean, essentially, they decided, I mean, I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but I'm saying if we read Putin's statements over years and years, we know that it was a red line. And he made it very, very clear. So the Americans weren't blundering into anything. They were like, they knew the score. Essentially, but what has happened is, so my calculation was that Russia would fight this out to the end. They would fight it out as if Russia itself was invaded. No, I think their actual expeditionary force, which is essentially what it is, it's fairly small. It's 200,000 men or so. There is a reserve to come if it's necessary. The West, though, has unfortunately, I think one problem is the West has invested so much in Ukraine, morally, politically, economically, and it's actually almost becoming an existential crisis for Washington, particularly before the midterms, which Biden has to fight. So I'm very worried about this period before the midterms, up to November. Because I can only see escalation. I can't. This is one conflict. I cannot see an actual negotiated settlement coming in the near future. And if we don't have negotiated settlement, we'll have escalation. And we know where this escalation could go in the long run. And this is a very, very serious situation. So that's really what my position is with regard to Ukraine.
Yes, and ultimately, of course, these things will end up at a certain stage. And how do you see the sovereignty of Ukraine as a nation at the very end? Because the assumption by many people is that they will lose the eastern provinces in one way or another. Maybe internationally, international law would always say that Crimea, Donbass, Luhansk are part of Ukraine. They will always recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But at the end of the day, Ukraine will be truncated. Do you see this dichotomy between what international law says and between what factual reality says for some time to come?
Well, yeah, there's certainly a dichotomy, as you call it, between international law and reality in a sense. I think all states do actually override international law if they see it as a necessity to do so. I mean, we even see this here in Northern Ireland, where you have the British state are claiming, exceptional circumstances to override a treaty, the Northern Ireland Protocol they signed with the EU. So this is not an unusual thing in international affairs at all. Also, obviously, Trump did it in relation to Iran. But what I was going to say was, I know that I recently, became aware that the Russians actually went to China, to Xi, and said, what is your position in this before the war? And they came across this. They actually advanced the same argument. This is what I've heard anyway. Is that we do support the Chinese. We do support international law, but we will review the situation according to the necessities of reality. They made a statement like this to the Russians, and I can honestly say that's what's really essentially happening. Now, I think what's going to happen here. I think Crimea. The West knew right from the start, and I think you see this in articles right across the Western media. And from important people, obviously in the American administration, Crimea is they realize that's lost to Russia unless they can actually win it back militarily in some way. Donbass would have been an autonomous part of Ukraine if Minsk II had been ratified. But that's another story. I've been writing about this in the last few weeks, and it's very mysterious what happened over Minsk II. But I think if we look at sort of what's going to happen here is that essentially what the Russians are sitting on now, they're going to take all that area down to the Black Sea, Kherson, and all the way. Maybe I think they might advance to the west of towards Istria, and they cut off Ukraine that way from the Black Sea completely. I think what I've been hearing is they'll make an offer to Kiev at some point in the next month or so, and that offer will be, you take the status quo now, or we go further. And I think that's what's going to happen. The other issue that is also unfortunate is obviously there's a lot made in the West about the HIMARS and the great effect they've had. I'm not certain about that, or certainly they have had some effect. But the problem that the HIMARS create and other ordnance the West is supplying to Ukraine is that they are actually in some ways things that the Russians have to neutralize. And their range is very important because the Russians at the end of the day are probably thinking they will be faced with a sort of a long-term bombardment over a line of contact, a little bit like the Karabakh situation. So how do they neutralize long-range artillery? I mean, the only way seems to be either through missile strikes or actually taking more territory. And, you know, there are some people of the belief that the three possible outcomes of the war now will be Ukraine losing 20% of its territory, about 40% of its territory, the Dnieper River, or maybe 100% of its territory if the Russia. I don't know what the will is in the Kremlin. I don't know what the military capability is of Russia. Well, it probably is. It probably is sufficient to do that, but whether they actually judge it's political to do so, and whether it's worth it to do so, I don't know. But I think the bottom line is this: that the longer the Ukraine fights, the more the West supplies Ukraine, the more Ukraine is going to suffer, and the more territory it's probably going to lose. That, I think, is where I would see this at the present moment. But it's a very difficult situation for Kiev, because to make an actual agreement or anything, not only are you probably going to run up against Washington, but also the strong elements within Ukraine that are going to oppose a negotiated settlement at this point in time. And I think this is why this situation is tragic, and it's very, very difficult to escape from it.
I was having conversations with Paul Goebel, former advisor to the U.S. State Secretary, and he said that this war is not going to last. It's not going to end anytime soon. And he said something very interesting. He said that probably it will carry on till Mr. Putin will no longer be in power. How do you appreciate Mr. Putin's ability to survive this existential crisis between the West and Russia? Where do you see him at the end of the journey?
Well, I mean, I certainly think this is the prime objective of the Western interest in Ukraine as an instrument of geopolitics, is to unseat Putin. I mean, the Western view of Putin, which you can read through books if you read between the lines, but it's fairly specific over the last sort of since around about mid 2005, 2006, I would say. Any books that have been written about Putin in the West, I mean, they essentially say this, you know, that Russia was well, the Russian viewpoint is that Russia was down and out under Yeltsin, and you know that's I don't think people would argue against that. It was becoming a failed state. It lost its superpower status. It was fragmenting. It was a pretty bad place to live. Actually, a good example of how bad it was is because, well, one way you can see this is because the eastern provinces in Ukraine and Crimea actually voted or decided to stay with the Ukrainian state, despite being, unhappy with certain policies. They actually rather would stay with Ukraine than join Russia, because Ukraine actually a better place than probably potentially to live in, or was certainly advertised as such in the 1990s than Russia was. But what has happened, and this is the thing really that's changed the landscape, that Russia has been revived under Putin. No matter what people think of Putin, he's revived Russia. He's given it a new sense of purpose. He's stabilized it. He's put the oligarchs under a leash, let's say. They have a certain role, of course, but they've been told to stay out of politics. They can have their ill-gotten gains, so to speak, but they've been shackled. And I think, generally, Russia has become maybe not to the level of, certainly not to the level of what it was during the Soviet Union, but it's certainly, resurrected itself. There's been a resurgence, a Russian resurgence. And I think a lot of Russians have a lot more self-respect as a result of it. And I think, this all goes to, is all to the good for Putin. Of course, there's strong pro-Western elements in Russia who really would have liked Russia to become a type of normal Western society. These are the people that are obviously opposed to Putin. I think, wars tend to go two ways. If you fight wars, countries cohere, against the enemy, or they fragment and the leadership or government's overthrown. I think that the first scenario is what's happening in Russia. And I think we'll probably get into this later on in discussion, but there's a lot of geopolitical elements that are also accelerating, let's say, in the background as a result of Ukraine. And I think this is changing the balance in Russia between the more pro-Europe, what would we call them, liberal Democrats or something, against the more Eurasian, more possibly we'd call them more authoritarian, traditional Russian governing elements. So I think, you know, I can't see Putin being overthrown short of a military disaster in Ukraine, and it doesn't look to be a sign of that at present. At the start of the war, I think there was quite a few Russian blunders, but maybe for the first 2 or 3 weeks. But after that, the Russians seem to have learnt, what they're doing, and essentially doing it in a more effective fashion, in a more business-like way. So I can't see this happening unless the West escalates the war in some way that is not really anticipated at this present time.
Just quite beside the point, I'm a strong believer in the British English judiciary, and I believe that it is immune from to political effects and influences. But there was a very famous case, I'm sure you remember, in 2012, Berezovsky against Abramovich. As you know, Boris Berezovsky was one of the key figures of Yeltsin's regime, and Abramovich was the greatest oligarch of Putin's time. And in 2012, everybody was saying that, because Berezovsky was a critic of Putin, was saying that Putin changed the machine because Yeltsin was engaged in this revolution, transforming Russia from old Soviet system to new liberal European system. And some people believed him in Europe. Some people didn't take him very seriously. I'm sure Lady Gloucester's, her judgment and last words do not have any political connotation. It was a mere articulation on the legal parts of the story. But I wonder, had this case been in 2012 between Abramovich and Berezovsky, given their political credentials, what would have been the case, the result of the case? I doubt it would have been different, but still, one wonders how public would have reacted to it, because Abramovich's popularity and clout in the UK is going down. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Maybe you're asking me really about sort of the British relationship with oligarchs and things like this. Well, I mean, it's been long, obviously Abramovich was, the great owner of Chelsea Football Club and brought them great achievements. So he was immensely popular in Chelsea.
And my last question was that it was about the perception of Putin in Europe. I made a reference to the case between Berezovsky and Abramovich. Berezovsky was saying at the time, he said that either Putin will go or Russia will collapse. He was saying this in 2011 and 2012, and no member of British establishment used to take him seriously. But had he said these words today, it would have been received a different reception. So my question to you, I do believe in the justice, the judiciary of Britain, and I don't believe that it is susceptible to political influences and so on. But how public would have reacted to that decision, which Abramovich did win, had this case been in 2022, not in 2012?
Well, it's a bit of a difficult one to answer that, but obviously, the political landscape has completely changed, and it always does get changed when there is a sort of a strong moral war being fought, which essentially what Ukraine is. It's the most moral war since possibly even 1914. But all the the Russian oligarchs and all Russian culture, everything is really non rigueur, as they say. So I can only see people being against Abramovich these days. They certainly wouldn't have been supportive of him. I think his point about Russia has to go or whatever will collapse. I think there was another alternative though. The alternative was that Putin was going to stay and Russia was going to revive, and I essentially think that's what's happened, and that's what's behind all of this. I just think that America didn't perceive quickly that Russia would revive. Also, it seems to have embarked on for the last 30 years, up to really about this year, it was courting China, and it was building the Chinese state up. In fact, the British were doing this as well during the Cameron-Osborne government. So and what happened was that Putin and Xi got together and formed a sort of a more concrete alliance, and they shattered the old Nixon strategy of the 1970s to divide Russia and China. This has been a big implication geopolitically as well. I think this will come up later on in our discussions, but it's just been a huge change in the geopolitical landscape. This event, there's nothing as comparative to this since God knows the start of the Cold War, I would say.
Yeah. But given what's happening in Ukraine, Russia is extremely busy there. It's a primary battle of the Russian Federation, and some people are telling me that this could be the beginning of the end of the Russia as a power, as a great power, because it's not just about Ukraine. It could lead to the disintegration of Russia, and there are lots of allegations, lots of speculations. I'm not taking them very seriously, to be absolutely honest with you. But I wanted to ask you to, incrementally switch to the subject of Azerbaijan. How do you see the implications of the fact that Russia is primarily occupied in Ukraine in the context of Azerbaijan-Armenia peace process? Because there is a Russian military contingent, the term of which expires in 2025. There have been certain skirmishes in March, if memory serves me correctly, and some people saying that Azerbaijan may use this moment in order to limit the Russian influence in the truncated part of the former Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. What is your take on that?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think I'm going to have to take this question in a series of chunks. Let me first think about Russia, right? I think what Putin did prior to the special military operation or war, whatever we want to call it, is that he basically he went to secure his back. He went around all his allies and his neighbors, his good neighbors. And he essentially, I think he asked them what they wanted on the basis that he couldn't have them as enemies. He couldn't have them as troublemakers when he was, as you say, concentrating in Ukraine. And if we look at that, obviously the really big example of that was the actual, the talk with Xi at the Olympics, and possibly Xi said, hold off until after the Olympics, please, but essentially there was an arrangement done there. It's quite obvious that happened. But there was a whole series of things that have happened since that have, so I think, thrown light upon this. I mean, first we have, in specific relationship to Azerbaijan, we had the Declaration of Allied Interaction, which I'll have a look at in a minute, but I just want to look at the context of it first. Then we have these other things like the Ashgabat Caspian Summit. Of course, that's sort of a thing that goes on periodically, but it had a greater importance this year because essentially Putin was securing the Caspian. Essentially, that's what he was doing. with the literal states around it, you know. And then we have the Tehran summit. So we have a whole series of events where Putin is basically smoothing over. Maybe if we took the phrase that was used, I think, early in Erdogan's terms about zero problems with neighbors. This, I think, is what Russia was doing in this, has been doing in this period. So essentially, that's what Russia's been doing. It's been making a series of small sort of maybe concessions, whether they're substantial or whatever, I don't know. But that's what it's been doing. Well, just to get more to Azerbaijan, then I was looking actually at the text of this Article 1 of the Allied Interaction Declaration, and it's it's interesting. And it says, I took some notes on it. It promises mutual respect for independence, state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inviolability of state borders, as well as adherence to the principle of non-interference in internal affairs and peaceful settlement of disputes. Now, this actually, seems to be a really good concession, that a formal concession that Azerbaijan has won from Russia. And I think at the time when this was issued, this Allied interaction, specifically, I think it came about 1 or 2 days before the special military operation. I think that people were a bit shocked at it. I saw some sort of reaction on social media. You can not always say that's representative, but it was shock at it. But when you look at this, you can see what a big prize this is, to get a declaration like this. Whether the Russians, whether they don't in the future twist some of these words, there's possibility of them being twisted, particularly the last paragraph, of peaceful settlement of disputes. This might be used if there's maybe conflict from the Armenian separatists. I don't know, but on the surface, it looks like a really good concession that Azerbaijan has won from Russia in a time of difficulty. The Irish used to always say, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. And maybe Azerbaijan is taking a leaf out of the Irish playbook, that Russia's difficulty is Azerbaijan's opportunity. It looks on the surface like this. So yes, I think this is certainly one aspect. Do you want to continue with the question in a more specific way, and then I'll go into it in more detail, because I've lost my train of thought.
Okay. The Russian military contingency. The first question I would like to ask you, I've been reading your articles to that effect, and once I quoted you, you said that the history, the humanity is littered with total victories. But they are not the essential victories. The most important victories are sensible victories. Probably I'm misquoting you, but I think that gist of what you said. Because in 2020 November, some segments in Azerbaijani society, militant segments, were saying that why on earth we did not go to the end? Why on earth we did not get Khan Kandi? Why on earth we did not resume the full control of that sovereign territory of Azerbaijan? And I remember your comment. You were saying that would have been total victory. That would have been that was a sensible compromise. And you praised President Ilham Aliyev's vision, wisdom, and ability to understand, because doing the right thing is essential. And he did the right thing in that context. Could you explain what you meant when you said that you did the right thing? And is this really sensible compromise for Azerbaijan? And what is the danger of Russia staying in Karabakh beyond 2025? Because, as you know, there is a 10 November or 9 November trilateral declaration, which is only legal basis of the military contingency in Karabakh. It says that they are there for the peacekeeping mission, but there is no mandate. It doesn't say what they're going to do. There's no clear-cut functionalities there. And some international lawyers are telling me that actually, from the perspective of international law, this peace contingency operation is not peacekeeping operation, because peacekeeping operation from the perspective of international law should be drawn from countries which are not involved, and Russia is very close, and there are many, many conditions which are not satisfied. So my question, the three questions here. First of all, do you still believe that was a sensible compromise? And second question, do you believe that Russians will leave in 2025 or in 2030? And what do you think about the way they conduct themselves in Karabakh?
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question, Orkan. Funnily enough, a few weeks ago, I was rereading. I've written a book on the 44-day war. It should be soon published, I would say, in the next few months. And what really surprised me, funnily enough, when I reread the book, because I just had to read it for just to check the final draft and the sort of like index and things like this. But what really surprised me, because I wrote it at the time of the war or just after the war, and what really surprised me was the amount of space I gave to the problem of Russia. It really takes up quite a lot of the book, maybe about 20% of the book, about the problem that President Aliyev had essentially in trying to second guess what Russia would do at certain points of the war. And I think this was the big problem. I think, the military operation was obviously a very efficient military operation. It was very successful. It had been well planned. It was executed in a really effective way. Everything. I think the big problem, the big geostrategic issue in the war was whether Russia would intervene or at what stage it would intervene. And this question can never be answered really. But in my opinion, I think that the stopping at Shusha was probably a good decision, without a doubt. I looked at this and I thought, well, when you have to think of opponents, which we'll probably say that Russia is an opponent in this situation, although it's a facilitator of peace at the same time. But they are a political opponent, just like Russia and Turkey may be collaborators, but they're also geopolitical opponents in the same way. You have to empathize with them. You can't just have a sort of like an idea they're an evil power and they're going to crush us or whatever. Ireland would have the same relationship with Britain essentially. We have to live with Britain. We've had a problematic history with Britain, just as Azerbaijan has a problematic history with Russia. We have to live with Britain. Azerbaijan has to live with Russia. So at this point, I think, why would Russia have intervened in this situation? I think we had this obviously unfortunate instance of the Russian helicopter being shot down. That obviously is a problem, but obviously Putin didn't react in a very aggressive way when Turkey did a similar thing in a very dangerous period, I think back in 2016. But I think what was really worrying, I think, was an Azerbaijan movement against Kankendi, where essentially there was substantial Armenian resistance, and there was maybe lots of civilian casualties, and there was pictures of Armenians fleeing and stuff like this, which was quite possible. Because most of the Karabakh war actually took place. It was a military war. It was waged as a pure military conflict. The Armenians obviously fired missiles at Azerbaijani cities, but Azerbaijan conducted it as a purely military conflict. But they didn't really have to assault any large centers of Armenian population, like, for instance, the Russians are doing in Ukraine. This becomes very problematic. Even in the West, there might have been a cause for Western intervention. But in Russia, I think Putin, my estimation of it was there would have been Russian nationalists who wanted to help out the Armenians, without a doubt. And I think Putin is not a Russian nationalist. He's a defender of the Russian state, and there's a slight difference in that. He looks after Russian national interests, but he's not necessarily one of these crazy Russian nationalists you occasionally see in the Duma and people like this. Some of them very pro-Armenian. So I think he had probably pressure on him about intervening. And I think if there'd been a humanitarian disaster, as it's sometimes called in the West, quite quite, not the intention of the Azerbaijani army, but it was even manufactured by Armenia. Russia might have been very much prone to either directly militarily intervening or intervening in such a way as like the West has intervened in Ukraine by supplying very dangerous weapons to the Armenians, which could have been used from the territory of Armenia against Azerbaijani forces in Kaljabar, or if they'd have moved into Kaljabar or Lachin or whatever, which were easily strikeable. So I think, I think the war was concluded in such a way that it ended on a very good high point for Azerbaijan. And not only that, it actually attained the occupied territories without bloodshed. And essentially, the great advantage for this is the obvious, most important thing that happens in the next few years, up until this 5 years or 2025, when the Russians can be requested to leave, is that there's reconstruction in Karabakh. So resources have to be put into repopulation, in building infrastructure, all these sorts of things, because really this task has to be taken in chunks, I think. It has to be taken in steps. It's a really big task. I mean, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think only the first people are going into Agdam now and people like this. I mean, it's taking a long time. It's taking nearly 2 years after the war to get people actually back into these territories. We don't really know how, whether people will move back in large amounts because obviously they've been away for so long. They've established lives in other places. Things like this. A lot of people have maybe died and things like this. So I think this is going to be a tough task. And taking on the Armenians in that situation, and maybe taking on Russia, I think that this was certainly the right decision to make. Now, the second part of your question is, and it sort of infers this. It infers that if the Russians don't leave in 2025, this was the wrong decision. Now, I don't agree with that either. I think we don't know if the Russians are going to leave in 2025. On paper, it looks like they should. And this declaration, the Allied interaction, seems to suggest that they are going to respect this. It's very difficult to know. I can't really say. What is Russian objectives in the South Caucasus? Obviously, it's to maintain some form of influence, but it's also to keep the West out. And that's their primary objective. And the problem I think the Russians have, if we try and empathize with them, and why we sometimes say they play the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis off against each other, which they undoubtedly do. Most states do this divide and conquer thing. But there are probably other aspects to this that are problematic for Russia, and that's the situation in Armenia, because the Armenians are actually probably more likely to jump to the West than Azerbaijan is. It has sizable diasporas in France and the United States. I think initially the EU and the Western sort of like what would we call it? Interest in the South Caucasus prior to the Ukraine war was directed mainly at Yerevan. I think they're trying to prize Armenia away from Russia. Now, this presents a problem for Russia, because how do they balance the forces in Armenia to prevent this? So there's a lot of complex layers in this that I think will go into this Russian decision. I'm sure the Russians will, if they want to stay, they'll probably make up some excuses about instability and all stuff like this. And I'm not sure whether what Azerbaijan's objective will be in 5 years' time, whether it will be to ask the Russians to leave in 2025 or to extend the agreement for another 5 years. I'm not sure. That might depend on how effective reconstruction and repopulation has been. So I think things are there to play for.
Russia is perceived with a great deal of skepticism across the former Soviet space. And
yeah.
There have been some Russian peacekeeping contingency in Moldova, in Georgia, in different parts. And usually the impression is that when they come, it is not exactly their first intention to go back as soon as possible. But Azerbaijani-Russia agreement in this particular case is slightly different because, as you know, it's a peace agreement, it's a ceasefire agreement. Trilateral declaration under international law is not a peace treaty. And I've been told that Azerbaijan has been specifically focused on the fact that this contingency is not given treaty-based legitimacy, and Azerbaijani side is focusing on the temporality of their presence there. The term, which interestingly enough, not used by Russians regularly as Azerbaijanis use. So my feeling is that Azerbaijan does see it as a temporary phenomenon, temporary period, and does not want to give it certain degree of legitimacy, which could have ensured its semi-permanence. That's my feeling. But also, of course, the relationship between Moscow and Baku, which have been cultivated over the past 15 years. President Aliyev and Putin formed a brilliant chemistry, and I think all of those things will be important. There are many questions I would like to ask you, Pat. I hope you have time to respond to those questions. One of the most important takeaways of the ceasefire declaration of 2020 November is Zangezur corridor. The term corridor is not used in the trilateral declaration. Only the term corridor is used in relation to Lachin, but the relevant provision of that article says that the Republic of Armenia is obligated to ensure unimpeded, unobstructed access of goods, cargo, persons from the Nakhchivan to mainland Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijani argument is that it is pretty much similar to the provision related to the Lachin corridor. Also, term corridor is not used. How do you see the future of these negotiations? Because clearly there is some element of extraterritoriality. Because what Azerbaijan wants unimpeded access. Azerbaijan does not want Armenian security forces providing security element along that portion of land, and Armenians are understandably worried about it because some Armenian commentator was saying that during the Second Karabakh War we lost Karabakh and now we're going to lose half of Armenia, because from their perspective that portion of land may be very tiny, but it may in the fullness of time lead to the loss of entire South Armenia, soon province of Armenia. How do you see, will Azerbaijan and Armenia be able to come up with a compromise construct where Azerbaijan will achieve its unimpeded connection between mainland Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan, and Armenia's extraterritoriality concerns be placated?
Yes, I think it can be done. I've read a little bit about the sort of concerns in the last few weeks, and I'm seeing two sort of different things. You can possibly correct me on this because I've seen different interpretations. I think obviously the Armenians don't like the idea of Azerbaijan constructing a corridor, or anybody constructing a corridor across their territory as such. So we are talking about an extraterritorial sort of corridor, but they obviously don't like this idea. They also, I think, they have a worry that it will cut them off from access to Iran as well. So I think some people have suggested this can be constructed also partly across Iranian territory. I'm not certain if that's true or not. I've seen this comment made, and that it could be initially started and it could, basically go right along the sort of line of the border. I'm not really certain. I think there's previous infrastructure there already, a railway track or something like that. But anyway, apart from that, I think it can be done. I think, but we have to sort of empathize with the opponent, with the enemy or whatever. But we want to think of the Armenians as differently in the future, hopefully. But, what's their concerns? Their concerns is that there's this corridor blocks them off essentially, and maybe takes a huge chunk of Zangezur. I've forgotten what they call it in Armenia, but you know, they're concerned. So I think, you know, it has to be done in a certain way, involving possibly wider parties like Russia and Iran, that actually, you know, assures them that this is like an extraterritorial corridor. There are probably railway linkages. It could actually be at certain points lifted off the ground. In other words, you know, given bridges, and in which roads can be constructed beneath it and stuff like this, or whatever way. I'm not sure about the geology of the river Aras there, but I mean, there must be some sort of you know, infrastructural possibilities there. I think, you know, it has to be sold to Armenia as an opportunity for them, like as a trade opportunity, and like all the agreement, the trilateral agreement, it can only be overcome. The negatives can only be overcome and the obstructions in Armenia can only be overcome if they see the positives, the economic positives that will give people jobs, livelihoods, and prosperity within Armenia. And if that can be done in conjunction and collaboration with the whole region, this will undermine the obstructionist elements that obviously persist at this time in Armenia. But this is really the only way this can be done, I feel. But it can be done.
We know that Nikol Pashinyan on occasion says quite plausible, progressive things, and I've been following his rhetoric for some considerable time. He said some ludicrous things in 2019 when he said that Karabakh is Armenia and full stop. And that was a moment when OSCE Minsk Group wasn't doing very well. And that was a clear renunciation of the OSCE Minsk Group process. And in my judgment, it was a first blow to the reputation of OSCE. And then what happened, the war, and of course, Nikol Pashinyan is not in a position to reiterate the same thing. But after the war, he step by step, I think, tried to prepare Armenian population to the peace treaty, peace settlement. And in December, for example, of 2021, he said in a press conference, I think it was on 26 December, that even within the OSCE process, there was absolutely no chance for Karabakh to be independent outside Azerbaijan, because all of those principles cumulatively would have led to the construct within which Karabakh would have stayed with autonomy, but inside Azerbaijan. And then in March, I think it was in April actually, after the second Brussels meeting, he said that you know, we need to lower our status expectations because the international community expects that Azerbaijan's territorial integrity must be recognized. But then he vacillated. So he also plays his own game, and the opposition is very strong. And you said about economic benefits for the entire region. Sometimes political ambitions may outweigh those obvious economic advantages. I think this is one of the problems of modern Armenia. And the next thing I wanted to ask you is about Iran, because when I was asking about Zangezur corridor, you mentioned Iran. We do have memorandum of understanding with Iran. I think it signed in 2021, if memory serves me correctly, in March. And that is the connection between the mainland Azerbaijan, East Zangezur province of Azerbaijan, with Nakhchivan through Iranian territory, which some people say is aimed to placate Iranian concerns about Zangezur corridor, because Iranians say that this Zangezur corridor, the borders will be changed, and it is utterly unacceptable. So something must be worked out with Iran too. And currently, I think recently there was a meeting between three great leaders, Iran, Turkish leader, and Azerbaijani leader, There's the feeling that in Azerbaijani foreign policy, that if you want to be on the safe side, if you want to have zero problem, as President Erdogan used to say a couple of years ago, you need to have good relations with all your neighbors. And in our case, in the region, Russia, Turkey, and Iran are three grand neighbors with all of whom we need to have good relations. How do you see this good relation between those three countries, which have complicated relations? Azerbaijan, Turkey, first top-notch relations. Russia, Azerbaijan, slightly complicated, but plausible things outweigh negative things. Iran, Azerbaijan, lots of problems. But this design, if this design emerges, how will it affect American clouds in the region?
Well, yeah, well, you've raised a number of issues here. I mean, well, let's just start maybe with Pashinyan. I think, you know, we'd have to sort of appreciate his predicament that he's in. He's lost the war. He's remained in power. The logic of his situation is to proceed with the agreement, but he has to proceed carefully and slowly. You know, I have been a fierce critic of him in the past, but I do appreciate his difficult situation. So he's probably proceeding in a sort of a zigzag way, which is often done by statesmen. He may prove to be a good statesman in the end, but that's something we can't, that is playing itself out at the minute. So we will see how that goes. But your second sort of part of your question is actually probably more important in a sense, because it is actually through these other actors that Pashinyan will be, or whatever happens in Armenia, won't be made irrelevant, but it will be overridden by other considerations. Because if there can be a regional, regional cooperation, collaboration, particularly on economic things, and I appreciate your point that politics often overrides economics, and I agree with you completely on that. And I think that the only way that you can get economics, eroding a political opposition is by its effects over time. And so that's why I think these things should be proceeded with to sort of show the benefits and to demonstrate the benefits to the Armenian people. And they should be gone ahead with, even if other aspects of the peace process are stalled. So anyway, to get back to the point, yes, the relationship between Turkey and Russia and Iran is very important, and it is developing, and it's also developing as a result of of a number of factors, not only to do with the Ukraine war, but also certain aspects of the American administration's sort of past behavior, which is certainly pushing Turkey to the east. Let's say this is quite obvious that Turkey's starting to look eastwards to in a greater way, partly because of economic developments, partly because of political antagonisms towards the West. You know, I looked at just a sort of like what would you call it, a sidebar or whatever. I looked at something Biden said, you see, during the war. I was looked at it in his website there. I just came across it there. You know, the way he described the war as the Karabakh War in 2020 as a humanitarian disaster for the Armenians. Right? He said the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh had suffered too much, and they needed their security protected. And he called for the stopping of the advance of Azerbaijani troops into Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, that was what he put on his website when he was campaigning against Trump. You know, and then obviously you've got the situation where he recognizes the so-called Armenian genocide. You know, I mean, this is deeply hypocritical, and it can be seen as deeply hypocritical in Azerbaijan because, for instance, he's supporting these separatists in Karabakh, and he's lending American weapons to bomb separatists in Donbass. This is just so hypocritical. And, you know, I think the Americans are on the back foot in the South Caucasus and have been for quite a long time with the OSCE and its failure and really the inability to do anything. And it's the pull of the Armenian diasporas in the United States and in France. And we can see all the resolutions that were put through Congress during the Karabakh War, which obviously Azerbaijan must look at and say, you know, this is hypocritical. They see us as they basically see us as you know, seconds to the Armenians, but they come to us when they want some energy, when they want some gas, when they want, you know, this looks terrible. It just looks really bad. No.
I have a vivid recollection, three of us being interviewed. I think it was 2 years ago together with Richard Hoagland, himself, and myself. It was after the French Senate adopted the resolution to recognize so-called Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. And there was a very interesting moment there, which I mentioned, and I believe that you articulated a similar thing. France being co-chair of the Azernews group, supposed to be neutral, and adopted such a outrageously ludicrous and appalling and preposterous thing. And then the foreign ministry said that this is not a political decision. Our position as a state remains intact. It doesn't affect our role in the OC process. It's just the Senate. But the questions that begs to be answered is that the Senate, yes, it's not foreign ministry, but it's a part of the French political system. You cannot claim that your one is important institution, upper house of your parliament, is making such a decision, and you are, as a French ministry, saying that it's unrelated. And that moment, I felt that France is over. Does not have any moral entitlement to be involved in this case, and just recall that particular moment when you mentioned Biden in his campaign against Trump.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem for the Americans gaining influence. Now, I've read a lot of stuff, over the years by Matthew Bryce. I think he's a great friend of Azerbaijan, and he obviously wants to promote American progressive actions in the South Caucasus, which is very laudable. As is actually the that the EU should actually start funding things like demining and reconstruction, which is great. There's nothing wrong with this at all. The problem lies with whether there's another agenda. We'll probably get on to that.
I believe where we left it, it was Ursula von der Leyen's trip to Azerbaijan, and the historic memorandum of understanding has been signed between Azerbaijani president and EU official. We knew the details of the draft details of this document beforehand from EU Observer and Reuters. So what I was imagining that the deal between Azerbaijan and the European Union is to entail three fundamental things. First of all, investment in the gas fields, gas explorations, plus existing gas pipeline systems. And also, it should all be in line with climate change objectives of the European Union. How do you see this memorandum of understanding in terms of Azerbaijan's increasing clout in the European Union energy security, in the efforts to diversify and reduce dependence on Russian gas?
Well, certainly, I think, as I mentioned before, this phrase that Europe's difficulty is Azerbaijan's opportunity, and it's obviously a good chance to exercise some leverage over Europe after a period of time when Europe has been not so beneficial to Azerbaijan in relation to things like the conflict in Karabakh. So certainly it can only be for the good that Europe has a problem now, and Azerbaijan is going to help out to solve this problem. So that can only be a positive, essentially, and it's a good piece of statesmanship to utilize your resources to actually, obviously bring about greater influence in the West. I mean, that can only be a good thing. I think the Indian geopolitical writer M.K. Bhadrak Kumar, he saw this as a slightly different thing. He saw it as I think a quote I have here is that Europe was engaged in a synchronized US, EU, NATO move in the Caucasus targeting Azerbaijan with a view to undermine Russia's consolidation in the Black Sea and Caspian Sea region. So there may be a geopolitical aspect behind Europe and the United States' wider agenda, but I think, that doesn't take away from the fact that this is a good opportunity to help out neighbors and should be availed upon for the benefits it will accrue to Azerbaijan. So certainly, the positives should be grasped while recognizing there might be another agenda behind it, and exercising a statesman-like position toward any other agenda that possibly might be there.
As you know, Azerbaijan has gas resources, and they are currently sending 10 BCM through the westernmost section of the Southern Gas Corridor. But Russia used to send, before the sanctions, 148 BCM, and Azerbaijan cannot be considered as a savior of Europe in the context of the problems with Russia. And now it's going to be doubled from 10 BCM to 20 BCM. It's a consequential volume, but this volume is not going to save Europe. In that context, some people are saying that relationship with Azerbaijan, even in the energy sector, it's not mostly about economy, it's about energy provision, but it's more about politics. It's making sure that Azerbaijan is closer to Europe than to Russia.
The EU is not going to replace, Russian energy resources with Azerbaijani resources. I think Azerbaijan can supply around 4% potentially in the next few years of Europe's energy or gas needs, whereas the Russians currently supply around 40 to 60%, depending on what you actually believe. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, I do hear you okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just got a different screen there. Right. So, obviously the situation is that you're perfectly correct. Azerbaijan is helping out, but it can't meaningfully reduce EU dependency on Russian gas, as actually Gubad Ibadoglu from the LSE actually wrote an article about this quite recently, looking at the economics and the statistics in this. So yeah, you're right. There is a political agenda behind this as well. It's really to in a sense, to the long neglected South Caucasus from Europe's point of view. Europe is sort of awakening up to the geopolitical importance of the region, and particularly to the geopolitical importance of Azerbaijan. And it's essentially, trying to get some belated influence through, EU soft power. And I think that's really what is behind it. And the Europeans are suddenly becoming, we will help you with the peace process, and we will help you with demining and things like this. The crisis has obviously, focused their minds on maybe the failings of the past. Let's put it like that.
Yes. I mentioned it earlier, but when I first heard about this draft memorandum of understanding, which was submitted by the European Commission to the European EU member countries, there were lots of details, but one thing, in my view, was missing. It is very clear if Europe wants to get more gas volumes from Azerbaijan, there must be investment in Azerbaijani energy sector. And Azerbaijani economy minister Mikhail Japarov in Switzerland in May, he was in Switzerland in May, he said that there was a shift in European approach there was underinvestment in fossil fuels because there was a drastic change to green energy. Don't you think that that's the desire, this decision, urge to switch to green energy was slightly precipitate, and that undermines Europe's energy security in the short term in the first place. Second thing I want to ask you, Europeans were always conscious of the fact that even if you are relying on one gas supplier with whom you have excellent relations, it's your top-notch friend, but then you shouldn't have one supplier. You always need to have a couple of suppliers to be on the safe side. And now in 2022, in the light of the Ukrainian energy, Ukrainian crisis, which engendered energy crisis, Europe is taking drastic measures. How honest Europe is in its desire to get rid of the Russian gas dominance? Is it something which happens within a short space of time, or is it something part of a longer term project which simply accelerated within a short time period?
Yeah, you're certainly correct. I think, you know, Angela Merkel, she's been sort of criticized in recent times since the war of, you know, Germany remaining particularly too dependent on Russian energy. I think, but, you know, in a sense, you know, there was a logic to this policy because it gave Germany and other parts of Europe cheap energy, which lowered the competitive costs of production. So there was a lot to be said about it. What was possibly a little bit more problematic was Merkel's policy on closing down the nuclear stations in Germany, which we can see now at present, you know, that France is not having the same amount of energy problems as Germany and other states because they have a strong nuclear program. And obviously the Green lobby is very, very strong in Germany, and it's actually in government now. And essentially you know, exerted its influence in the past. And of course, this the Green Agenda, what it actually did, rather than diversify, actually made Germany more dependent upon Russian fossil fuels. So this was an ironic twist to this. I think the second part of your question was how long this has been going on. I can remember, funnily enough, reading an article. I was teaching economics last year, and I was reading an article from an old sort of a supplementary thing for teaching, and it was from 2014. And one of the article was, you know, is Europe too dependent on Russia and for its energy supplies? And it went through the arguments, the economic arguments, and essentially it's so this has been discussed for long periods of time, 8-9 years, and it said, you know, that Russia needs the energy. Need the energy customer more than we need it, which was a sort of the conclusion was sort of like, you know, that maybe we didn't need to do much about this because it would hurt them more to actually, you know, lose us as a customer than it would to for us to lose them as a supplier, which actually is now shown to be a very false argument, because as we see now that we're getting rationing in Europe. For gas, 15% voluntary rationing. There's also been a massive spike in gas prices this morning. I think it's gone up by about 10%, and the alarm bells are really ringing across Europe. Europe is in a funny position because what it's saying to the Russians essentially is this. It's saying, you know, you are using energy as a weapon against us, right? I mean, I find this very strange, you know, this argument, because, you know, how can you say to people, right, we don't want your energy now, we don't want your energy in future. We're actually also supplying your enemies and we're killing your soldiers, but you're being very cruel to cut your energy off from us that we don't really want in the first place. This is not a very logical argument, and I think, you know, but we all know the reason for it. Europe can possibly do without Russian oil and gas in the future, or maybe about 70% of it, but it can't do without it in the next year or so, or 2 or 3 years ago. And that is what the problem for Europe is. In the short term, the LNG from America, any alternative supplies from Qatar or from Saudi Arabia cannot make up this difference that they're going to suffer. So as Darshini David, the economics correspondent at the BBC, wrote this morning, she said, let's just pray we have a mild winter. That's what it's been reduced to.
I want to go back to the Moscow Declaration, which signed between Azerbaijan and Russia in 22nd February of this year. The moment was critical, of course. I do not know to what extent Azerbaijani Foreign Ministry knew about the upcoming incursion into Ukraine. Probably some knew, some don't, some didn't. But the timing was very pivotal. And that declaration was a declaration of alliance between Azerbaijan and Russia. And there was an important element about energy cooperation. President Ilham Aliyev, on a couple of times in his interviews, even in the interview given after that declaration, said that we cannot compete with Russia. The volumes are not comparable. 10 BCM could be doubled, it become 20 BCM, but 148, it's a different scale. So that's the first reason we can't compete. And then he said that even those areas where we feel there's elements of competition, we will obviate competition. So we will not compete. At the same time, he signed a memorandum of understanding with Europe. He is very keen to play his own role in Europe's energy diversification policy. So I think that his maneuverability, ability to be nice to Putin and also to be nice to Europe, sort of balance to this conflicting considerations, deserves respect. It's a behavior of a grand politics, grand politicians of high caliber. How do you see his maneuverability? Because on one of your articles, you mentioned that the shifting sands of the Eurasian geopolitical area requires great statesmanship. How do you see Ilham Aliyev's current behavior from that perspective?
Yeah, that's certainly true. I totally agree with that. You know, and what he's saying in this energy debate is very, very incisive, because some people suggest, for instance, you know, this is a transformative event, you know, that suddenly, you know, Azerbaijan is like rescuing Europe. And of course, President Aliyev knows this isn't actually the truth. What Azerbaijan is doing is helping out Europe in a corner. And reason why that is important geopolitically, to understand the difference between those two things, is because of the fact that although it gives Azerbaijan temporary leverage over Europe and it will be beneficial, it doesn't in the long term, because essentially Europe would have to stump up a lot of costs for maybe transportation, infrastructure development, but also, you know, 4% does not replace 45 or 60%. So essentially, this is like a limited amount of leverage that Azerbaijan is gauging. So Azerbaijan cannot, you know, sort of, you know, take a position whereby, oh, all things will be rosy in the garden between us and Europe in the future. You know, it can't afford to do that. It still has to balance the other interests. Now, on the wider question, you know, about sort of the general balance sheet in the South Caucasus, the only way of actually assessing, you know, Azerbaijan's performance is by assessing it as against its neighbors. And if we look at its neighbors, we look at Armenia. Armenia, due to its territorial expansionism and due to the fact that it's, you know, it's a dysfunctional state and it's neglected itself as a state, it's fallen into a terrible dependency on Moscow. It's essentially a dependency on Moscow. There might even be some Armenians would like to take Russian passports. It's that bad, really. You know, I mean, what was it all for? You know, the independence they gained after the collapse of the Soviet Union, if they can't exercise that as a functional, independent, sovereign state, right? Secondly, if you look at Georgia, Georgia's had its problems. It initially followed the Azerbaijani road, but, you know, under Shevardnadze and Shashkevida. But the problem they run into was in 2008, you know, when, you know, they were sort of lured into the NATO, let's join NATO club. And, you know, NATO didn't take their back like they've done with Ukraine. And they were defeated very quickly, and that led to territorial loss. Now they're in a situation whereby they've become redependent on Moscow economically, but also they've got the disdain of the West. The West is not very happy with them. And essentially, it's, you know, it has sidelined them for EU membership and for various other things. So Georgia's not in a good position. And if we look at Ukraine, it's obviously a tragedy in Ukraine. They've lost 20% of their territory, a bit like, you know, the loss of Karabakh early in the 1990s. And, you know, they've suffered a disaster, you know, economically, et cetera, et cetera. So looking at Azerbaijan in comparison to that, its wise balancing statesmanship, its stable leadership over years has paid great dividends. And, you know, it has regained territory. It is an economic powerhouse. It's a geopolitical hub. It is negotiating with more powerful nations. and forming relationships with them. There's nothing that can be said negative about the Azerbaijani leadership over the last couple of decades, in that sense. So, we have to assess it.
You were in Shusha, I remember, I think it was during the diaspora event. Am I not mistaken? You were there.
No, you are mistaken. I've never been to Shusha, no.
I was in Shusha, and then I met Svante Cornell, one of the distinguished scholars, and he made a very interesting point there. He said that South Caucasus used to be unified, should be together. It's a destiny, and they bound together. And he said that only one country, which is Azerbaijan, can lead this process because of their political consolidation in the country, because of the vision of the Azerbaijani president and Azerbaijani leadership on the whole, because of its resources, energy clouds. Armenia, you said its dependency protectorate, or whatever we may call it. Georgia, you said it's got some similarities with Azerbaijan, but still certain problems there. So would you say that if the South Caucasus is going to be a unified force in the fullness of time, it is Azerbaijan which will be at the helm of it?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Yes, I mean, I read Svante Cornell's article in Baku Dialogues recently. It was very good. It's on those lines, actually, assessing the sort of overall, the potential for each state and the position they're in at the present minute. Yeah, I would certainly say that. One thing that, that comes out of this actually is that, and I think this came out this was a very significant factor during the Karabakh War. Azerbaijan actually gained geopolitically against Russia because it had established itself as an independent, strong, sovereign country with a strong economy that Russia had to respect. Because, Russia losing Azerbaijan as a good neighbor is actually worse than losing Armenia. And I think this played a big fact in the lack of Russian intervention during the war, because Putin, at the end of the day, he respects strength. He doesn't respect weakness. He'll walk all over people that are weak, and if he can get away with it, he'll do it. But to lose Azerbaijan as a good neighbor, which is what Azerbaijan essentially is, it would be a high price for Russia to pay, and in the geopolitical considerations from Moscow, this is a very important factor. I think a lot of people underestimated that during the war. Even pro-Russians. I remember reading a lot of pro-Russian bloggers who were very much, like pro-Armenian. They didn't even understand Putin themselves. And I think that this is very, very important. That strength comes from strength. Absolutely. And that's essentially the case.
Power recognizes power. The reciprocity there. I was having a chat with Paul Goebel, and I may misquote him, but he said something very interesting. He said that in South Caucasus, I think he said that Georgia is. I think he said Georgia is the way, Armenia is the means, and Azerbaijan is prize. So Azerbaijan is the most consequential country in the South Caucasus from the Russian perspective. And this is perfectly in line with what you articulated there. This is very interesting. One thing, I'm not sure whether I asked about it, but it's about Russian military contingency, about their expiration time, whether they will leave or not, whether Azerbaijan will face legitimacy to them. I think we discussed it at the beginning of our conversation, if memory serves correct. Yeah. But there is one slight fear in Azerbaijan on the grounds of what Russian practices have been. They give Russian passports to those breakaway territories, and once those people have Russian passports, then the arguments emerge that they are our citizens, we may protect them. Some elements of that might have happened or possibly happening in the truncated part of Nagorno-Karabakh. How it is dangerous for the Azerbaijani government's sovereignty, and how Russia will play this card against Azerbaijan from your perspective?
I think it's undoubtedly true that Russia will play this card, but the question is how they'll play it. I think, you know, when we look at this situation, maybe the Armenians that are still in the rump of the old Nagorno-Karabakh, they're obviously the question of unification with Armenia, or Miatsum, or whatever they call it. It's just out of the question now. It won't happen, right? They haven't the military means to do it. They won't negotiate it. So they may be thinking to themselves, well, the only thing that can preserve us is through becoming part of Russia. That will deny the Azerbaijanis taking our territory from their point of view, right? So they will try. That's what they might try. Now, Russia, yes, will they play this card? They'll certainly play this card to try to wring sort of some forms of concessions out of Azerbaijan. Will they play the card to the end? In other words, would they go through with this? Well, I think that's what basically the declaration, why this was so important, the Declaration of Allied Interaction, which seems to sort of like suggest that they're not going to do this because they're talking about territorial integrity and inviolability of state borders, etc., etc. So this was why it was a good concession. But it doesn't mean that the Russians won't use it as a bargaining chip, which is what they'll be doing all the time. So they may look for some other concession that Azerbaijan has to give them. I don't know what that will be, and that will depend on Russia's needs and Russia's security interests and things like this. It might form the basis of some other type of concession that they look from Azerbaijan that might not be connected but with Karabakh, but might be connected more with the overall Azerbaijan state. So this is a possibility.
In 2025, 6 months before the expiration date, Azerbaijan will be able to exercise its veto rights, and there will be bargaining chips, of course. And I don't know what we can offer to Russia to make sure they leave. Or maybe it will be within our best interest that they do not leave yet and they stay. It may carry on for the next 5 hours. So the circumstances there are shrouded in obscurity, and we are merely speculating to that effect. And you said about Armenian unification, Miatsum. Interesting enough, I mean, I speak to Americans living in the States, in Europe, and very intelligent people. Intellectual caliber is there, but some ludicrous ideas about the future of Armenian nation. One Armenian, I think his surname is Hakopian, he said that it is my wish to live in an area which will be Armenian sphere of influence from Caspian to Istanbul to Arabian Sea. But sadly, our population is limited. We cannot claim that. I mean, you think for yourself. The population is 3 million. Even in those glorious days of Tigran II, if I'm not making a mistake, their scope was quite limited. But this gargantuan ambition, this brilliant, last, bombastic ambition, and at the same time, the limitations of resources and the lack of historical facts substantiating these hopes. This is something which I fail to grasp to understand about Armenian national psychology.
I mean, it's their not only, it's their weak spot. Essentially, it's ludicrous. Their ambitions are way beyond their means to achieve them. That's essentially it. And even if we go back in history, we find that when Lloyd George decided to let them down, so to speak, and he handed over the problem of Armenia. Of course, the Armenians had contributed to the Allied war effort against the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. But suddenly they became a problem because Lloyd George was a very effective politician. And the first thing he pointed
the origins of 1922 committee recently.
Exactly, exactly, to get rid of him.
Connecting.
But the first thing he said is Britain discovered these Armenians had ridiculous ambitions, and he passed the problem on to President Wilson, who also failed to solve it. So, you know, this is the thing. They don't seem to realize this. They live in a myopic world, a world bounded by their own horizons, where they have absolutely no empathy for anybody else. And the most important quality of statesmen is to have empathy for opponents and enemies and to see what they're going to do. But they don't have this. They have, and perhaps it can only develop out of shock and disaster like the Second Karabakh War. But you know, let's hope it does develop, because there are obviously large amounts of Armenians who just want to live in a functional state and earn their livings and have a job and have reasonable amounts of prosperity, you know?
Yep, I just realized we left 10 minutes. I will ask you two questions only. One is about Turkmengas, and then I will go to the last question, which I promised, about Tory leadership race. Turkmengas is very important. It's the biggest country, I think the fourth largest reserves of gas. But the problem is that you don't know how to bring that Turkmengas to Europe. Azerbaijan is it should go to Azerbaijan. There was a massive plan called Trans-Caspian gas pipeline, but it was very costly. I mean, Iranians and Russians had some, in my view, contrived ambitions, accusations and objections on the grounds of environmental factors. But how do you see Turkmen gas in the future of the European Union's energy security and the benefit that Azerbaijan may gain from this?
Well, Pepe Escobar, geopolitical writer, long serving writer of 20, 30 years now. I mean, he looked at this and he said that Azerbaijan, when he was talking about Azerbaijan as a sort of like, in the question of replacing Russian energy, he dismissed this obviously, but he said, Azerbaijan's role might be more important as a transit hub for energy through the Caspian. And I think that's possibly true. But the issue would be, who is going to fund these infrastructure, superstructural projects? Because essentially it's Europe that needs this energy and gas if it's going to be done in a really, really big way. I don't think Europe will have this money after the Ukraine war and after the disasters, the economic disasters, the blowback that's occurring, plus the lack of cheap energy in the future. So I think this is going to be different. So who's going to have this money? China, maybe? China are obviously the big, could be the big funders of these infrastructure projects in the future. But what is it going to be in it for them? I don't know. It might take place as a part of a big regional settlement in which there's investment comes from China, Russia, and it integrates a whole load of regions like, including Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Iran, etc., and the Central Asian areas. And this would obviously be in the geopolitical interests of the Eurasian project, so to speak. So it could occur. I can't see it occurring to Europe's benefit, though. That's what I would say. Maybe for Azerbaijan's, yes. But I just think the economics seem to go against the Europeans putting their money in their pocket to fund such a thing that might be beneficial to them. So it's more likely to be a Eurasian project, I think, in the long run.
I mean, I think that a project was proposed by this US-based organization called Trans-Caspian Resources. One of the chairs is the former American ambassador to Turkmenistan. They got some interesting plans, but where money will come from, it's a big question, and no one knows answer to that question. Yeah. And my last question, as I promised, about Tory leadership race. Boris Johnson was compelled to resign, and there were many circumstances. I believe that history has an uncanny propensity to distinguish between trivialities and substantial matters, and I believe in the fullness of time, substantial matters will prevail over realities. Because Boris had a ground persona, and it's a great loss for the Conservative Party. It's a great victory for the Labour Party because when Johnson came to power, if you remember in 2019, we wanted to prorogue Parliament and lots of hashtags, not our Prime Minister, not our Prime Minister, because Theresa May failed miserably, and then landslide victory, tough years, and now he's compelled to resign. How do you see this continuity process after Boris Johnson? Because there is treacherous Sunak who backstabbed Boris, and there is Liz Truss who's considered to be continuity Boris. My feeling is that within the Conservative Parliamentary Conservative Party, I think there are 358 MPs in the Parliament. They might have preferred Sunak, but when it goes to membership, which is around 200,000, the Boris sentiment will prevail. But as you've told me a couple of times ago, you said that Conservative membership must balance two fundamental things: who can defeat Sunak in the first place, and if there is a new general election, who can defeat Starmer.
Yeah, I agree with a lot you said there, Orkan. I think, Johnson was, overthrown on trivial matters. Now, you might say, oh, these are not trivial things, but unfortunately, things that were considered trivial in the past have now been sort of erected into sort of like substantial things, which, of course, none of these things were. And I think the Tory rank and file certainly now regret the demise of Boris Johnson, and probably if they could have changed their minds, they would do it. I think, yes, there's two candidates. You've got Rishi Sunak, the ex-chancellor, and Liz Truss, the foreign minister. I think, yes, Rishi Sunak wielded the knife, and of course he's going to pay a heavy price for that amongst the membership. Liz Truss is, as you know, to me, she's got more political ability than Rishi Sunak, who seems to have been performing particularly poorly in these presentations, and he is also, because he's chancellor and is too tied up to the rather unpopular policies of taxation that are unpopular amongst the Tory rank and file. He's going to pay a price for this as well. So, really, Truss is Truss is really, is sort of, and Boris actually put the knife in Sunak himself in the final PMQ, where he made reference to certain things he thought the next leader should do, which was basically, it was like writing a job description for a candidate you wanted to take your job. And that's what he did. And so I can see Truss winning this election amongst the members, no problem. She is but she isn't Johnson. This is the problem for her. And this is why she might struggle to win an election. Johnson was essentially, he was a maverick, but he had appeal amongst the ordinary people of England, particularly, and which Truss won't have, I don't think. Johnson was a Macmillan type Tory, Tory patronage sort of system, whereby, one nation Tory, I think was the word for it, But Truss is positioning herself as a Thatcherite, which is not what Johnson was. Yeah. So Thatcherite, okay, so Margaret Thatcher has a lot of kudos in certain Tory circles, but she's also very unpopular amongst large sections of people in England as well. So this may not win an election, and maybe Boris will come back after the election, and they'll be glad to have him back.
I'd to ask you, because Boris Johnson achieved sheer impossible things, becoming mayor of London on 2 terms, Labour-inclined city. Johnson became the leader of the mayor of London, not because of the Tory leader, he was Tory, but because he was Tories. He made Brexit possible. He came back, landslide victory. His campaign role was absolutely fundamental. And as I understand, you believe that the project Return Boris is not entirely unfounded.
No, it's a possibility. It's not very usual in British politics that ex-prime ministers make a comeback, but I think in this case, a little bit like Donald Trump, there's a possibility in it because of the sort of, in Trump's case, the disasters of Biden presidency make it a possibility, and in this case, the potential disasters that will occur over the next year or so. I think anybody will struggle to pull the UK out of the situation it's got itself into. So I think Boris could have another innings, to put it in English cricket terminology.
Yeah. We have less than a minute. Pat, thank you very much indeed. I'm most grateful to you. Thank you very much.
No problem.
I feel that time is flying, and I would love to have a conversation with you lasting for 6-7 hours, preferably in Dublin or Belfast, which I'm sure will happen very soon.